All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming here. This is our 7th general body meeting this semester, and we have a few announcements to share. First of all, this is going to be the conclusion of the 3-part series for developing a decentralized application with Nathan. A week from today, we'll be doing Bitcoin Demystified by one of our very own members, Felipe Faria. In between then, we have our first tailgate with LSU. We'll be meeting up at the Continuum between 12 and 3. And feel free to come up to me with any questions. I need to RSVP to know how much food to order. 2 weeks from this Saturday, or 1 week after this Saturday, will be the tailgate with Perry Ann Boring, who is the president of the Digital Chamber of Commerce over in DC. She'll be joining us, and that will be another great tailgate for Texas A&M. And she'll be sticking around that Monday to do a panel with another folk who is a Gator alum. We'll be asking any current events or anything that involves the government or blockchain or anything we want to chat with her about. Besides that, we post everything on Facebook. We have a couple of AMAs coming up. One with the CEO of Airbits and other folks at Airbits, and then the other one is with Consensus people that we'll be sure to share on social media. I'm going to start making these announcements every meeting. We're looking for people to get involved. We're looking for people to be part of either the exec board or of chairs or of committees that we'll be forming. We want this club to continue to be a success from this semester and for the future. And to quote one of our very own members, he said that this club a year from today will be able to fill an entire auditorium. So let's work towards that goal. Without further ado, Mr. Nathan.
Hey, all right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you, everybody, for coming out. So today, like Joel was saying, it's part 3 of the development workshop. The last part, we're developing our front end. Last time, we sort of built our smart contract and pushed it to the network, and we saw how much of a pain it was trying to interact with it through the command line. So today, we're just going to be developing the front end so that if, any user can use it without having to know anything about Ethereum or basically the behind-the-scenes stuff. So if you aren't caught up or you couldn't come to the last meeting, all the code right now is on this link right here on GitHub, github.com/nupochi/double-escrow. And this is going to be the completed code, but if you look in the defaults, I have like a defaults folder there where you can replace it and follow along if you want. So the first thing we need to do when we're developing the front is we have to think about what the application should be for the users. And so to save time here, I'm just going to show you the finished product because we have a lot of stuff to get through today. So, sorry. This needs to be... Make sure every time that you restart your test RPC, you're migrating over, because if you don't migrate over, then none of your contracts are on your test RPC. So we have to try truffle migrate. And then again, that's deploying the contracts onto our test RPC, which is just a simulation of the blockchain, so we don't have to download it all. So now that it's over, we can run our web server, and the application will show up as it's supposed to. But so last time we built a double escrow, which was basically like a button where people can send funds so they don't have to use some third party like eBay, and they can trade their items. So here, I'm trying to sell a PS4. If anybody wants to buy PS4 for some ETH, let me know. Use a smart contract. But basically, you can just see here what it would look like when nobody has interacted with it right now. So you're going to have the item, you're going to have some sort of title. I tried to keep as much of the default truffle package, or the default truffle web HTML page that came with it, because we're just trying to do something really quick here. But so yeah, you have a title, you have the item, you have your price that you basically you have a space where you want to interact with the application, and we just have a status thing here. So now that you have like a general idea of what we are supposed to make. Let's go through it. So the first thing we want to do, and I'm going to get back, because this is the completed version, I'm going to go back to our example application. So make sure that you are going into your folder for your example application through the terminal. So you want to open the terminal, change to your desktop. I put it as example project, and we can do that here. Spin up your test RPC, and I'm just going to open up the project. Okay, so this is opening it up in Sublime. We have our whole directory structure here on the side. So what we made last time was this smart contract for the escrow. You can go through the code on GitHub if you want, but we did that last time. So now we're going to look at our index, and this is just the example index that comes up with Truffle. It's for that Metacoin application that we used as an example of what we were going through in our first part as an introduction. So now let's try and change the structure of our web page so that it'll fit what we just went over, what our idea of the application should be. So we want to keep all the useful stuff that Truffle comes with. So we have this stuff for fonts, for our actual JavaScript connection that's going to bring the functionality to our web page. And we have just some basic titles here that we want to change. So let's change Metacoin to double escrow. We'll change this to double escrow as well. And this was specific to Metacoin, so let's just delete it all. Send Metacoin, we can delete. And some extra breaks there. So now we have a really bare bones application that we can work with. Let's just go to Google and find a picture of a PlayStation so that we can have that picture on our front end. It's already in the code, but let's just pick it out here. All right.
Not an Xbox.
What?
Not an Xbox.
Not an Xbox. No, dude, PlayStation's taken over.
What?
PlayStation's definitely more popular than Xbox. I'll make that bet. Anyway, okay, so now that we have the link, we can add the image into our webpage. So let's take this Metacoin here. I almost forgot this. But let's keep the header tag, because let's type in that title that we want, trade this PS4. And let's add our image tag. So tags in HTML are basically just defining all the different properties of the web page. So when you go through, you have these different tags. HTML is just defining that the language is HTML. You have a head tag, which goes into, it's sort of like the meta properties of a website. So that's the title that pops up here. That's in the header. The icon that comes up here, that's all in your head tag, because it's not actually on your physical web page. So everything on your web page is going to be in your body tags. We have different headers. These are just talking about the different sizes. And we're writing an image tag to display an image. So we can type source, which is an attribute in HTML. That's basically just saying what it is. And so now we have a link for the source of the image, but we don't want it to be too big, so let's also change the height just so it's not annoying. You don't have to scroll too much. So we can add different attributes to different tags. These are all publicly available. You can look them up. I don't memorize them. It's all publicly available knowledge. So let's enforce the size on that image. And now let's add the different spans, which are just going to be different divisions of our front end. So if you remember back when I showed you the front end, it's basically what we want is we want a label for the price because we want people to know what price it is. We're going to want a section for user interaction. That's going to be where the button's going to be where people actually interact with our website. And then we'll keep this status symbol just because it's useful for debugging and giving information to the user. So let's add our span and we'll label it price info. Make sure it's in quotes. And we can just end it. Add a break so that it's spaced out appropriately. We'll add a section for the actions, so we'll call this select action. And add another break. Okay, so this is pretty much a good start for our application. It didn't default too much from the original, but that's fine. So this is the layout, the prototype for our application. And there's not too much functionality into it. That's all the functionality for the website is going to be in your app.js file. So if you go to your JavaScript file and open up the application, again, this is the one that comes default with Truffle, so we're going to have to modify it heavily. But we want to make sure that we're keeping the useful stuff. So we want to keep the style sheet. It's just linking the special, I guess, the special colorings and different styles that we want on our website. We'll keep the default. This Web3 and Truffle contract are needed for Truffle and for interacting with Ethereum. So we don't want to delete any of that. This is needed for interacting with our contract as well, but we'll change it to escrow all here. So we'll change to escrow artifacts. And likewise down here. Okay, these two variables are useful as well. They're just detecting the accounts that are on. They're just variables to hold our different accounts. Maybe somebody has multiple accounts and you want to pinpoint some specific account for that person. And this is the way that we link somebody's, or hold the information of somebody's account so that we can interact with our application. And we have specific functions here. These are the JavaScript functions that go into the front end. So here we have the start. And there's also some useful information here. It's basically, this is used to, again, just sort of the back end for Ethereum and for Truffle so that we don't have to deal with any of that. So it's not really important that you know what that is, but that's all right. So here we're using the Web3 object that we went over last time. Just a refresher, the Web3 object is a JavaScript object that, or it's a JavaScript API that you interact with to sort of get information from the Ethereum network. So, and so basically what we're using here is we're just getting the accounts of the person that's visiting the site and saving that into our variables that we defined up here. And then we refresh the balance because we want, in this application, we refresh the balance. So since that's specific to the Metacoin application, we're gonna wanna delete it. This set status, this is useful for our application, so we won't just delete it, but let's delete all this refresh balance, send coin. It's not useful for us. And let's make sure we have the right parentheses because that'll mess everything up. Okay, and lastly, we have this code snippet down here. What this is basically, like we covered last time, events are basically things that happen in your browser. There are different events that you can listen for, like when somebody clicks on a button, you listen for an event for clicking on that button. When somebody sort of hovers their mouse over an area, you listen for events for hovering over an area, and such such things like that. So this event is listening to the load. So when you load the web page, what it's going to do is it's going to connect to, it's just more code to connect you with the Ethereum network and Truffle with the Ethereum network. And then lastly, down here we have apps.start. So because whenever you visit a website, you're going to be loading that website, we run app.start here so that we just start our application. So this we can leave as well. So now we've changed our DOM and we've gone through some of the functionality of the app.js file that we'll be writing in. And so let's start building functionality for our specific application. So right here where we define some other variables, we want to think about variables that will be useful for us. So when you think about our application, you're going to have the buyer, the seller, a certain price. You're going to have a state. So if you remember back to the last part, our contract sort of interacted in 3 states where you had one state, nobody was using the application. Another state where a seller sent their funds and posted an item for sale. So there's only seller funds there. And then a third state where a buyer also puts their funds there, indicates that he wants to buy the item. And those are the 3 states for our network. Or for our decentralized application. So let's add some variables here. So we'll say variable seller, variable buyer, variable user. Now this variable is sort of just detecting who is using our application right now. These other variables are going to be useful for reading what the state is from the Ethereum network itself, because maybe the user isn't the buyer or seller or something like that. And we need our current state, and we can have our price. Okay, so we defined roughly the variables that we'll need. Let's go into the writing functions that are going to interact with the Ethereum network. So, so the first couple of functions we're going to write will be to basically get the state, because, hold on, I think I have it here. Yes. So the Ethereum functions that we want to write first, right? The first thing we want to do is check to see what the state of the network is, because how are you going to load the correct web page if you don't know what the state is, right? So let's write a function called update page that'll basically make sure that we have the right state. And make sure it's in the right parentheses here. So let's write update page, just like the others. We'll have a colon and function. So this is basically skeleton of our function, just like every other function there. And if you remember last time, we're going to start going into JavaScript promises now, because blockchain blocks come in every basically not instantly. It comes in a couple seconds. For Ethereum specifically, I think right now it's around 20 seconds. You don't want your web page to be unresponsive for 20 seconds. You want to be able to do things while other code is running, and you want basically things to be asynchronous. So you say, okay, go find out the state of the network, and when you get that information, just give it back to me so I can display it on the page. But don't hold up any of the other stuff on our web page from running. So for that, we have JavaScript promises. So we'll type in escrow.deployed. This is just, this comes from Truffle. This is just representing the deployed contract that we wrote, and we deployed it on the network. And we have .then, which is the keyword for a JavaScript promise. And we add a function inside here. So, still talking about JavaScript promises. Basically, when you have this syntax, what you can think of, this instance right here, you can think of that variable as this escrow.deployed. Basically, you're saying, okay, go get escrow.deployed. And once you get that, then make it as a basically call it instance, and then perform some functionality on that instance. So now we can write something like return instance dot state, and we'll write dot call as well. If you remember last time, call is sort of it's like reading from the blockchain, so it's really quick, and it doesn't cost any ether or any gas to read from a blockchain. Only writing and changing the state of a blockchain will cost gas. So what you want to do is call it, because you don't want to pay money and you want the information quickly. So then, we're gonna write .then again, because we need another JavaScript promise to tell us what's gonna happen once that comes in. And so we can say function response. And just like the last one, response is basically referring to what was returned in here, which is the state. So we want to say current state, because we want to say the state, equals to response dot, and I'll explain in a bit what this means, toString 10 dot value of. Okay, so what this is, so you might be wondering what toString and value of is. Basically, anything that comes from Ethereum is going to need to interface with JavaScript, right? And things that are returned from the Ethereum network aren't directly able to interact with our JavaScript. So we need functions like toString to take the value of whatever was given to us, the current state. It's represented as a string, and we want to make sure that it's a string for JavaScript, and we want to get the value of that string. It's not intuitive, but just like any experimental technologies, a lot of the stuff early on is not going to be intuitive. These are just things that you sort of have to know. That's why it's useful to come to these sort of workshops. So after we get the state that we want, basically we want to know who the user is. So we'll chain our function call here, and we'll say app.checkUser. And this is going to be a function that we'll write basically right now. And why we're kind of chaining it is because you want to make sure that these things aren't coming at different times. So like I said before, when you're using JavaScript promises, things aren't going to be guaranteed to come back immediately. You're sort of saying, okay, go get that information, let me know when it comes back. So if I'm to write these promises, it's going to run that code, wait for a response, and then the code under that is going to start running. So if it's entirely possible that the code under your asynchronous JavaScript calls is going to complete first. And we want to make sure that we're basically these commands are running in order so that we can get the right information out to the user, because it's going to mess up the way that we detect what the state is, who the user is, if it's not coming in a sequential order. So that's why we call checkUser here in the promise, because we know that it's going to only run after we get the state. So let's write our function for checking the user. So we'll write the function checkUser function. And so when we're calling this function, we don't know who the user is, and our application is going to have a variable that held who the user was. So we can just overwrite that by giving a different value to the user. So by default, if, let's say, nobody was interacting with the contract, it was just, there was no buyer, there was no seller. So the user isn't anybody. So we're going to say the user's unknown. And then, so this is like the default value for our user, for our application. Now we want to check if the user was the seller, update that user variable, and display things that are unique to the seller. So let's go in and type escrow. We're going to check for the seller here. We can just write a comment. And so to check for the seller, we need to get it from the Ethereum network. So we're gonna write another JavaScript promise. Everything in Ethereum, getting it from the network is gonna be through JavaScript promises. So let's type escrow.deployed .then function instance. And we can basically call the value in our application. Let me pull up the contract here. So when we made these variables in our contract last time, and we made them public, it basically gave us these default getter methods, so we didn't have to implement them ourselves, right? So now we can read these values from the blockchain without making a transaction. So that's another reason why up here we did instance.call. Is everybody can read this, right? It's not too small or anything? Okay. So we had instance.state.call. We just basically used the automatically generated getter function. So we want to use that for these variables up here as well. I'll close out of the index because we're not doing anything with that anymore. So let's just return, just like we did up there, up here in our update page, instance.seller.call. And we can, basically once we check for the seller, we want to make sure that we get the information, because when we return seller, what the seller is an address that we defined in our contract. And because Ethereum returns things that aren't directly compatible with JavaScript, we're gonna have to write code to basically get the value of that address. So let's type again, .then function response, the response being the seller, and we can say our seller variable in our JavaScript that we defined up here is going to be equal to the response that we get from the previous call, to string and 10. Don't ask me why 10. Honestly, I don't know. I just looked up and that's what everybody uses. It's 10. All right, so now we have the response from the seller, and we can check if the person that's visiting our site, the account that we have, or the account that's interacting with our decentralized application is actually the seller. So we'll say if account is equal to seller, then the user variable is known to be the seller. And then we're gonna go later on into actually building the functions for updating our front-end website, but these are all functions interacting with Ethereum right now. So when we want to update the physical page, we're gonna call that application update the choices, because we wanna make sure that we're displaying the right choices to the seller when they're interacting with it. So when they basically want to abort so going back to our application that we wrote, we had these different functions that we could use, and these functions depended on the state. And these functions were post the item for sale, which happens when nobody has interacted with the contract and they want to post an item for sale. So you make the person the seller and the item is posted for sale. Then you have the buyer that comes along and basically runs the function to say, okay, I want to buy your item. I confirm that I intend to buy your item. I'm going to send funds to the contract so that you know that I'm trying to buy your item, and you can send the item to me. So we have a function for basically purchasing the item, and then we have a function for the buyer to, in an ideal scenario, basically the seller will sell the item, post the item for sale. The buyer will declare that they want to buy the item, so they'll put funds to the contract. And then the seller, offline, the seller will send the item, and then once the buyer gets the item, confirms that it's what he wants, he can press confirm purchase, and then the funds will be distributed then. So that's another function, confirm purchase basically. And the different areas that we can basically, this can fall through is when somebody is posting an item for sale, but nobody wants to buy the item. We don't want those funds stuck there forever. So we're gonna have a way for the seller to cancel the sale so they can get their funds back. And we're also going to have a function for when the seller can basically refund the buyer. So if the seller tries to sell, or basically the seller offline sends the item, the buyer opens the item up, says, hey, this is not what I bought, and they sort of work it out offline. But because they both put in a deposit in the smart contract, they both have an incentive to get a resolution. So people will naturally want to work it out, and basically the buyer will send back the item to the seller, and the seller will basically cancel the whole exchange, and the funds will be distributed that way. So we have 5 distinct functions that we want to write. So let's start writing those functions.
Is there a way to use a modifier to check if the current account is a seller, as well as the state later on?
So that difference, modifiers are unique to Solidity, and that's our contract programming language.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so since we're working with JavaScript now, JavaScript doesn't know, as far as I know, maybe it's not, JavaScript doesn't know what modifiers are.
Gotcha.
It's just a concept unique to Solidity.
Got it.
So yeah. So let's write our functions. So we have the sell function for when the user wants to post the item for sale. And now we want to change, or we want to basically call this function through our UI so that we're interacting with the Ethereum network, right? So right now we can change the status. I'll update the index here, or open up the index here. We kept this status section to basically inform us about what's happening with the network. So we can just say, when the sell function is called, let's update the status. So we'll say this.status is, or this.setStatus, I'm sorry. It's basically what we're doing is calling, where is it? Yeah, wow, the function that's right here. So we're saying this.setStatus to a certain message, and we'll say, creating your sale post. And so, yeah.
So you mentioned like the person who wants to buy, they put in like a deposit and then they send their funds, but it's like held basically, and then the person who's selling puts in a deposit and then they send the item, and then the person who's buying has to confirm it first.
Mm-hmm.
And then once confirmed, the funds go in to the seller.
And
Yes.
And the buyer gets the deposit back.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this was explained in the last part, but the general idea is, let's say I have something I want to sell for 1 Ether. I'm the seller. I interact with the smart contract, and I put 2 Ether in the contract. A buyer comes along, sees the price is 1 Ether, wants to buy it. They put 2 Ether in the contract. So they have this extra incentive to make sure that the exchange is...
Get what they put in back.
Yeah, because nobody wants to scam each other because their funds are going to be locked in there, right?
Yeah.
So, I'm sorry, what was your question?
So like, what if the person who's buying doesn't confirm, or like?
Well, once they get the item, they'll want their funds back, so they'll be sure to go and confirm because they'll be out money. They'll basically paid 2 Ether for an item that was only worth 1 Ether.
Okay.
So it's basically just a
That's
game
just-
theory
yeah.
perspective, trying to get everybody to work
Yeah. Okay.
along.
I just
And
want
get along, yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Okay, so yeah. Now, once we call this sell function, these functions that we're writing here are going to be linked to the button that we're making. So once somebody clicks that button, it's going to be calling these functions here, right? So when somebody initially clicks the button, we want to tell them that the sale is being created. And this goes back to the sort of asynchronous stuff because we don't want it to be unresponsive, right? So otherwise, they would have no way to know, the user would have no way to know if the sale was actually being created. They'd just see a blank screen for about 20 seconds or so until it says, okay, your sale is posted. So that's why we let them know in the status that the sale is being created. And so when we were designing the web application, we had a field for when nobody has interacted with the application, where somebody could basically set the price that they wanted for the item, right? So now that we have this field, we're going to basically say, get the price from that field, so that when somebody's sending and making a transaction, they'll be transacting with that price. So let's write variable price in ETH. And we're going to say document dot get element by ID. And that ID is going to be the price input. And we want the value of whatever that is. So basically what this is saying here for the status and as well for down here is basically the document refers to the entire HTML document is called that we're interacting with. This is basically the skeleton of our application, right? So document just refers to our entire index.html. And then we have get element by ID. So IDs are unique identifiers for each different element that we have. So we have these IDs down here. We have price info here. And we want to make sure that we're basically we don't have it there now, but when we are going to be creating it in the future, we're going to have that input for the person to set their price. That's a different tag in HTML. So that'll be done a bit later, so hopefully you can bear with me or sort of picture this. But when a user basically types in that input field will have an identifier with it, and that identifier is going to be called price input, so that we can get the value that they typed into that field. So we have a variable for that. Now we have a variable for basically the total deposit that they have, right? Because somebody's posting an item for a specific price, but we need to make sure that they're putting in double that. So let's just have a variable for the total deposit. And a unique thing about, sorry, do you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. Your Sublime, what syntax do you have checked off when you're on the JavaScript? Just JavaScript, or?
I actually think this is default for Sublime,
okay,
if I'm not mistaken, but yeah, it just came with it, yeah. And that's a good point because there aren't colorings for everything. So Solidity's a new language.
Yeah.
Ethereum, Sublime's not going to support it. So what you can do, and what we did in our first part when we were setting up the environment, is sort of getting these colorations so it's a lot more attractive to look at and it's not just plain white text.
So there's like 2 packages out for Solidity. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, I think exactly. So that's what we installed in the first part to make sure that we're developing efficiently.
Mm-hmm.
So now that we have a variable for our total deposit, the thing that's unique about Ethereum or it's not unique about Ethereum, but something that Ethereum is represented by is Ethereum, and one Ether is divisible into a lot of different places, and basically the smallest unit is called a way, and everything that basically the way that you declare values is all defaulted to the unit of Way, which is such a small fraction of a penny that you don't want people dealing with that. But that's what the Ethereum network deals with, so you have to write code to interact with that. So we'll say total deposit in Way, and we'll use our Web3 object to basically interact with the Ethereum protocol. And we'll say two-way, which is just one of the functions that they define in their API, which is publicly available. You can look it up right here, yeah. So here I'm on the API for the Web3 object, and we have these, they have all the documentation here. So we have FromWay, which we'll be using as well, but two-way is basically taking any sort of Ethereum unit into Way. So because the price that the user lists is in Ethereum, we need to change it to Way. So that's why we call it a two-way function. And we'll say price in ETH that we just got from the field above, multiply that by 2 to account for their deposit, and then we have Ether as the unit. And for use later, we're gonna type in variable self is equal to this. And you'll see this a lot in different functions. And what this is saying is this refers to the, sorry, hold on. This, I don't know why it's eluding me right now, but this refers to something that's like the actual JavaScript. And later, if we're gonna try and use the abstraction for the JavaScript, we can't use the variable this. So basically this is just saying the application itself. So when we say, when we have window.app, that's what this refers to. Or yeah, that's what this refers to. And we just want to save the state. We just want to know what that is. So we're going to say self. And now we're going to send a transaction. So we need our promise, like we've been writing before, deployed. All right, nothing new. And now we want to basically send that transaction. And now it's kind of weird to think of it this way, because you'll see that it's basically we're getting the contract instance and we're saying, okay, return the transaction that we're going to make to the network. So it's sort of like, why would you want to return that? Why do you want the transaction? But it's useful for, that's just how you get out of the function, basically. It's not returning anything of value to us. It's just saying, okay, basically leave this function body when this thing happens. Do you have a good? Okay. All right, so we're gonna say post item. And just like we did in the last time, if we look at our contract, what we're calling is this function right here, post item, right? And for our post item, it doesn't take any parameters for its function call, but there are parameters that are unique and or that are global in scope to Ethereum. So what we want to say is there are very limited parameters for this, but one of such parameters is the value, basically the value that we're sending along with the transaction. And that value is going to be what we just described up here for the total deposit in Way. So let's type that out. Value is equal to total deposit in Way. And we want to make sure that that's coming from an account, from the account that's actually calling the transaction. The account that we get up here is the one that's sending the transaction, right? So, like I said before, somebody can have multiple accounts, and we want to make sure that we're sending it from the account that the user is interacting with the application with, and not some other one of their accounts. So we'll say from account.
Nathan, what's the relationship between ETH and Way and Gas?
Okay, so ETH is just a shorter version of Ether.
Right.
And that's basically the currency of the Ethereum network. And when basically what Ethereum is used for is it gets converted into gas. And what gas is used for running the actual application. So code is hosted on the Ethereum blockchain. And when you want to run that code, so all the nodes in the network have to basically run that code as well and make sure that it's being run correctly and that there's no chance of censorship or no chance. This is what gives its distributed nature, right? So people aren't going to do that for free. You need to send them money. And that money comes in the form of gas. So people, basically Ether gets converted into gas, and then depending on how much code is running, will basically determine how much gas you have to pay to run the actual transaction.
Right. And then with Way?
Way is the smallest divisible unit of Ether.
Okay.
The smallest divisible unit of Ether, and it's basically the everything that's internal in the Ethereum network. All the calls that you're making with the Web3 object are sending a transaction. If you're using this value, it's expecting the value in Way. So if you're trying to send a transaction with 1 Ether, you don't want to just type 1, because that would send 1 Way. So we need to basically make sure that we're changing it into Way up here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's that.
Yeah.
All right, so now that we've basically sent the transaction, once that's finished, so we'll say .then again, we'll run the code. And basically, we're not going to put anything in the parameter of this function that's inside of our promise, because what it would have returned is the transaction, and it's not useful for us, right? That's what we just went over. But so we just want to run code when the thing that happens up here is done. So once the transaction has been included and it actually has run on the network, we want to run code after that, right? So what we want to say is we want to let the people know that their sale has actually been posted and deployed to the Ethereum network. So we'll set the status of our web application to say sale posted. All right, now sometimes maybe somebody didn't send the right amount with their transaction, right? So if the deposit is, if there's a certain price in our contract, we require that the price be divisible by 2. Basically, there are requirements that we put in our contract for these transactions. Now, if these requirements are not fulfilled in any way, we want to make sure, basically, this is not going to return, and it's going to throw up an error, and then therefore this is not going to happen either. So what we want to do is we want to say, okay, what happens in the case that there's an error? So make sure that you're closing the right parentheses, because I didn't right here. All the promises make the braces kind of confusing. That's an easy source of error. So we'll say .catch, because we're catching whatever error is thrown. And that error is represented by this E right here. And basically we'll just, for our own debugging purposes in the console, which nobody would see on the actual UI, but for us, we'll just log what that error was. And for the user, we'll just set the status to error, that an error happened. We can just say like something messed up. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
That will relay on the HTML.
Yeah. So when we are calling these functions here, these set status functions, this set status function is calling this other function that we defined in our JavaScript. And what that set status function does is it finds in our index.html file, it finds the element that is referred to by status, which if we look here is right here.
Yeah.
And then it's going to set that text to whatever we passed in the message. Okay. So close the parentheses correctly. And it's a pain because whenever you open a parentheses in Sublime, it kind of closes it. So you got to make sure that you're not messing up there. And we want to write a semicolon after that.
Quick question.
Yeah.
For price and ether,
Mm-hmm.
I have a variable under the self function. The first variable stated front and back end.
Well, we have to. We have to get the price from the user. The user sets their price. So they have to input that value somewhere.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, got it. Okay.
Yeah, so when they...
Understood. Understood. I thought for a second that this was previously written, and then it was thrown to like a field of some sort, and then you would just read that field, like after it's been like written somewhere in the app. But yeah, I got it now. Excuse
Yeah,
me.
basically that text field that people enter the price in, we're just getting that
Yeah.
information.
Okay. Got it. Thank you.
Okay, so that was the cell function. Now let's, I'm not going to go into as much detail because a lot of the functions are very similar, but I'll just comment on what's unique about the different functions. So now let's write a purchase function. So we'll say purchase function. And we want to let them know that they're purchasing the item. Otherwise, it won't be responsive. Then we want to make sure that we can hold the window, basically our functionality of JavaScript in self. And I don't think I mentioned that before, but basically, if we tried to say this here to refer to the self, it would not refer to our actual JavaScript functionality. So that's why we defined it out here. All right, so now we can say we want to get the price, right? So we'll say price dot equals document dot get element by ID, and we're gonna get the price, and we want to get. This is sort of confusing because, again, we haven't actually created these elements in our document in our front end index, right? So just like here where we have this price input field that we put for sell, it's not actually right here yet, right? All we have is price info. But when we're dynamically creating these fields, we're going to make sure that we're going to create a section that basically is has the ID of price. Has the ID of price input. So we're going to dynamically create the input field, and we're going to set that ID to price input so that this code runs correctly. So you sort of got to think about what's going to happen in the future. So in our price info that we have in our index right here, we're going to update this to have its own internal field, right? So basically we want to say this is going to be the representation for our price label, and that label might say the price for this item is blank ether, right? And that blank is going to represent the actual numerical price. So what we're going to do is we're going to have a document item surround that price, that numerical price, so that we can use it in our front end, or in our JavaScript. So we're going to get that inner HTML, which is just basically referring to anything that's inside these tags. So if I were to write in here FE, and I called document.getElementById price info dot inner HTML, it would return me FE. So we're going to have that price info dot inner HTML a dot value of, because we want to make sure that it's represented as an integer and not a string. Okay, so now we got the price that's listed on the web page, and now let's call the Ethereum transactions. So we'll say escrow.deployed, just like before, .then function instance, return instance.confirm purchase, or I'm sorry, it's going to be instance.buy item, because that's what we called it in our smart contract. So we're calling these functions in our smart contract from these functions in our JavaScript. So we don't want to say confirm purchase, we want to say buy item. And we want to say that it's from the account of the person that's interacting with a web application. And we want to get the value. And last time we set the value to, we basically said two-way price and ETH, so that's the same thing that we're going to do here. So value equals web3 dot two-way price times 2, because the price that's listed there is the price of the item and not the deposit. And we're going to make sure that that's ether. And make sure that you have your braces right. Okay. All right. Now that we actually sent that transaction, we say .then, and we write it an anonymous function, and we update the status to say that, okay, they actually purchased the item. So just tell them that the item successfully purchased and to wait for the item to arrive. Okay. Again, we want to catch any sort of error that might happen because we enforced restrictions in our contract. So if some of those restrictions failed, those requirements failed, then we want to update that to the user. So we'll say catch that error. Self.set status error purchasing item. Okay. All right. So this is going to be sort of like the general structure of most of the functions I will write. So let's just sort of copy paste them for the rest. And I'll make it quicker. All right, so now that we have our purchase, we want to have our confirmation confirmation from the buyer. So let's label this function confirm. Let's set the status to confirming the item. Item as expected. And we don't need to get the price anymore. I mean, we're just saying that the items, we just basically confirm that the item was expected. And when we are confirming the item, the function that we're calling in our contract is confirm item. So inside of our promise, we're going to want to say return instance dot get confirm item. And we want to make sure that that's coming from the buyer, so from the account that's interacting with it. The only person that would be interacting with this function would be the buyer, because we checked that up in the beginning. And we want to tell them that item successfully validated, and we're going to tell them that their funds are going to be redistributed, or that their funds actually were distributed, because they were going to be distributed up here, but by the time we reach this code here, the funds will have been distributed. So we'll say funds distributed. And then when there's an error, we want to tell them that, okay, they couldn't confirm, error, confirming purchase. And since the buyer is the only one that can do this, we'll just let them know, are you sure you're the buyer? Okay, so we have sell, purchase, confirm. Let's do it for the abort and refund, and then we'll be done with functions relating to the Ethereum network. And then we can work on updating our UI. Sorry. Okay. So now let's do the abort function. I put it right under the cell because that's how they would be. That's basically where it would happen. The abort function would be called in the same or near the same state as the sell function. So that's why I put it there. So we'll say self.setStatus aborting the sale. Get that, we don't need this. We want to send the transaction for aborting, which we refer to as abort. So instance.abort. And we don't want to send a price with any of that, so don't send a price with it. All right, now once that transaction clears, let them know that it was actually aborted. So and if that didn't happen, then they probably weren't the seller, so let them know that there was an error aborting the sale. Are you sure you're the seller? Okay, almost done, last one. We basically want to say we need a way for the seller to refund the buyer if the buyer isn't happy with the item that was sent to him, so they can all get their funds back after, right? So let's change this to refund. Change the status yet again. It's very symmetrical. Don't need the price anymore. You're not sending any money with it. You're calling the refund buyer function, so let's write that here.
import the Solidity package?
Yeah, so that's all happening up here. So the stuff that we didn't remove from the default, this
There, import escrow artifacts from escrow.
exactly, yeah. So we didn't have to deal with any of that because Truffle did it by default. So thank God for Truffle. Otherwise, we'd be writing all this low-level stuff ourselves, and it's a lot more tedious than than what we're doing right now. But we're almost done here. So we let them know that we're refunding. We call a transaction to refund. If that transaction successfully returns, then say buyer successfully refunded. And if not, then say error refunding buyer. Since the seller is the only one that can do that, let them know that they gotta make sure they're the seller. Okay. Perfect, so we have just finished all of the functions that are going to be interacting with the Ethereum blockchain. So this is basically what's wiring up our front end to the Ethereum blockchain. And when people interact with it, they're going to just be clicking a button, and that button is going to call these functions that we wrote, which will send the transactions to the Ethereum network. And that's how you interact with it. But none of these functions actually did anything to the UI, right? So now let's write some functions for the UI, because we need to dynamically create those elements, right? Because right now, we don't have pretty much anything. We have these sections for what we want to put there, but there isn't anything actually there yet. So let's dynamically create the elements for our web page in a function, because what we dynamically create is going to be dependent on the state of the contract as well as who is actually using the contract, right? So let's start writing those functions. And if you weren't happy with all that kind of code duplication with Ethereum function writing, well, I'm sorry, but the easiest way to sort of make these dynamic things are basically just checking if the state is something, if the user is something, and then writing pretty much the same code in different scenarios. So we'll say update choices, or let me write this under the check user, because remember when the first functions we wrote, right, were update the page. The updating page function is going to fire in our, okay, so once the website loads, it's going to it's going to run the app.start function. And in our app.start function, we want to say, we want to update the page, right? Because if somebody's loading the page, they want the right page to what's corresponding to what's on the Ethereum network. So we'll say update page. So since start is always going to run whenever it loads, and start's going to run update page. So update page is going to get the state of the Ethereum, the state of the contract on the Ethereum network, and then it's going to check for the user after we know what the state is. So it's going to run this here, this function check user, and then we find out who the user is, and actually we didn't check for the buyer either. That was pretty bad. Let's check for the buyer as well. It's very similar to what we wrote above. Let's just copy paste it. So to check for the buyer, we just change seller to buyer. Change this variable here from the seller variable to the buyer variable, because we store those up here. And if the account is equal to that buyer, So basically, if the person interfacing with our web application, if that account is listed as the buyer in our smart contract, then we want to update the user variable to say that it's the buyer. And then we call this update choices. Now, update choices, this is what's going to update, this is what's going to change all of our front end dynamically. So we want to write this function now because we finished with Ethereum contracts. So let's, I'm gonna make sure I have commas here after every function, just real quick. But, so yeah, we finished with what we need for Ethereum. So now let's start running our UI, our functions to update the UI. So we'll write update choices. Update choices. And okay, so when we are updating the choices, what we're going to create is basically everything that's not on this UI right now is what we're dynamically creating. So we want to create a price label which is going to go inside this price info section, right? Because the price label is going to say something like, the price is 1 Ether. And the whole entire price label is the phrase, the price is 1 Ether. So let's create that document element. Sorry. I'm really sorry. Forget what I said about that document element. We're not going to create that document element. That price info, this price info section is going to be the document element that's holding that message for basically the item costs 1 Ether. That phrase is going to be referred to in our price info. So we'll write a variable called price label, because maybe we want to change what this price label says, right? If there's nobody that's interacted with the contract, we don't want to say the price is something when it's not anything. We want to say nobody's interacted with the contract. So we'll say variable price label is equal to document.getElementById price info. So we're just holding this entire section right now in a variable called price label. And we'll just set the price to 0, just to basically overwrite whatever was there previously, potentially. So let's update that. And now we can get the price from the actual contract. So this is still a function that we're using that's interfacing with Ethereum. So we'll say escrow.deploy.then function instance. And we want to return what the price is. So we want to go to the contract and get whatever the price, whatever this value of the price is. So escrow, so we want to return the price, and we want to call okay. Once we get that, we want to know what that price was, so the variable is actually meaningful, so we'll save that and refer to it as the response. And so we can say this price that we overwrote up here because we don't want some previous value. So we're just going to set that price variable to whatever value was just returned from our smart contract, because that's what the price is. It's in our smart contract, right? So so we'll say response.toString.value of, because we want to refer to it. We basically want to make sure that we're interfacing correctly with JavaScript, and then we want to make sure that we're getting the value of that string that we just made and making it an integer. Now we're going to call the Web3 object. That's gonna, basically because Ethereum only works with these way units, we don't want to return some price that's in way, right? Otherwise they might think that the price is actually 10 to the power of 21 ether, right? So let's make sure that we're converting from way. And we're gonna take whatever, what we just got from the contract, the price, and we're gonna say, convert that to ether. All right. Now, it's possible that the price wasn't set. So if the price is 0, that means that nobody has posted a sale. So that means that we want to update our label to say that nobody has made a sale yet. So if the price is not 0, then somebody did make a sale. So we'll say you don't need curly brackets if there's only one line after your conditional statement. So if the price is not 0, then the price label, we want to give that price label the message current price in ETH. And now here's something interesting. When you want to create elements, you can do this by passing basically in text. You can basically what I'm going to write now is in the text here, I'm going to write just one of these other document elements, right? So I'll say I want what I want for the inner HTML of price label. Price label is the doc is represented by is basically holding what this price info thing is, which refers to this whole thing. Now I want the inside of this price label tag to basically have these other tags, like this one that has down here, how it says strong, right? Because this is how I'm going to basically pick out the number value of the price instead of the whole message of the price in ETH is 1 or something like that. So let's write current price in ETH, and we're going to call this new document tag that we're making, and we're going to give it an ID of price. And you have to make sure to have these escape characters so that you're not actually closing the message there. You're basically saying, I want those actual quotation marks in my text. So we'll say span ID is equal to price, and then we'll close that. And now we want to get the, we want to put in the actual value that we got from the smart contract, right? We want to put that price in there. So we'll say plus price. And then we'll end the document tag that we're creating. Okay, so now, once this is loaded, we're going to have another document element, or a document tag here that has the ID of price and has the actual numerical value of the price. Okay, so if the price actually was 0, then we know that somebody hasn't interfaced with that contract yet. So we'll just set the price label to tell the person that nobody has made a sale yet. So we'll say no sellers sell this item. All right, and now that's all we need for updating the actual price label. But there are a bunch of other labels we need to, or we want to make sure that we're displaying the right button in our select action. So we finished price info, now we just have one more for the select action. So in that same function, we want to get that same, get whatever in here. And basically, we'll say document.get element by ID again. This is the same for, you always use this to get elements basically. We're gonna call it select action, the same thing that's in here. And we want to basically make sure that what's inside there is cleared out, because maybe we want to make sure that we're changing it every time, and we don't want something like, let's say somebody posts a sale, right? So previously they had a sell button there, and if you don't clear it out when you reload the page to basically to represent the next button that we're gonna have, which is abort for the seller, or maybe like buy the item for the buyer, then we're gonna have two buttons. It's gonna say sell, buy item, and we don't want that. So we wanna clear out what was there previously. So now we can check what state it is so that we can give the right button there and the right actions for the user there. So we'll say if the current state is equal to 0. Now, this might be a little bit confusing because our states that we have here, inactive, created, locked, basically you can think of these as having indexes, right? So inactive will map to a 0 index, created will map to a 1 index, locked to a 2 index, right? So when we say if the current state is equal to 0, then we're saying that the state is inactive, basically. And we got that when we basically checked for the state up here. So this current state is either going to be 0, 1, or 2. So if the current state is 0, and then we want different buttons for different people, right? So if basically if it's 0, then it's inactive, right? And if it's inactive, then there's neither a buyer nor a seller. So we want to basically create that prompt for enter your price, sell your item buttons, right? So let's put that prompt here. We could say, let's write some comments so we know what's happening here. This is the inactive state. So we can make, this means this is going to refer to the view for everyone. So let's make a label for the price field. So we can create a label by saying we're gonna put this tag and refer to it as a variable called label. So we'll say document.create element to create a new tag, and we'll label that as input. Now, if you remember, we use this down in our cell. Where is it? Post item. Okay, so I guess this is supposed to be post item. All right, no, this is cell. Okay, so we referred to it as price input here. So let's call it I'm sorry guys, I'm looking ahead. The label that we're referring to here is just like a header that we're gonna put up right before the price. So we're gonna create this element as a header tag, which is just one of these tags that we have here. And then we're going to put the whatever's inside that, and we're going to say enter your price in E. And now we want to get the select action because there's nowhere to put that label right now. So we want to get this section right here, which is select action. And the way that you put these tags inside here is by saying append child. And you want to append what you just created up here, which was the H3 tag here. So this means that it's just putting it right inside of, it's going to put it, if we make some space there, right here. Okay, so now we can make the actual price field that that sellers will be putting their price into. So price input. And now we're creating an input element, which is a specific tag for the index page for receiving input. And we're going to call this other function that we can create called set attribute, so that we give this attribute a specific ID, there are different types of inputs you can have. You could have some sort of text input. You could have maybe somebody's choosing between different bubbles, like if you have like, what's your sex, male or female, you can be selecting bubbles for that. You don't have to actually type there. So we're gonna say set the attribute type to a number because we don't want people putting in letters or anything like that. And now we want to set the attribute for the ID so that we can get that actual, we can refer to this tag as something so that we can get it later. And we'll refer to that as price input. Now, this price, we set this ID as price input because in our sell function, we're gonna get that later and we're gonna get it as price input. So we dynamically create this element, so the IDs need to be the same or else you're not gonna be able to get the right price. Okay, and now we can add that along. I'll just copy and paste this up here. All right, and now we want to make the actual sell button. So we create a sell button, and we want to create a type of button. And we want to have basically a text for this button that's going to be the inside of that button, right? So we'll just say, we'll say to create a text node that says sell this item, right? So create text node, sell this item. So this is a label that's going to be before basically the button that we're making. So this will happen before it will say sell this item, and then we'll have the button. So inside the button, we want to set text for that button. So we'll say, okay, so we'll say sell button dot set attribute. And we want to get we want to set the ID, and we want to set that ID to sell. So the sell button is going to be referred to by the ID cell, and we want to make sure that we're running a function when that button is clicked. So when we type, we're going to set another attribute, and this is a special attribute, and it's going to take an event on click. So when somebody clicks on the button, it's going to run basically app.sell here. So if somebody clicks on the button, it's going to run the function app.sell, which is going to run this here. And we're going to get the price from what we just dynamically created up here in the price field. Okay, but it's not actually there yet. We've created the element, but we need to put it in the actual document object model, our index.html page. So let's make sure, first let's append the text that we created up here. We want to put that in the sell button. So we'll say the sell button gets the text. And then we'll say that the select action, so document.getElementById, select action. And then we want it to get that sell button. So sell button. Okay, so that's all we need for the case when nobody's interacted yet. Now we want to say, what if there's the seller that put something up there and there hasn't come a buyer yet? So we're not in inactive, we're in the created state. So if current state. Okay, so we want to check if the person that's looking at it is the user, because if the person that is looking at it is the user, we want to give them the option to abort and get their funds back, right? But if it's anybody but the user, we want them to see something like, oh, okay, let's purchase the item, right? So we'll say if the user is equal to seller, which we updated the user variable when we checked for the user in our previous function, then we want to make the abort button here. So we'll say variable abort button. Create element button. I'll just create this. I'll just copy paste these attributes from here. So abort button. And we want the text for that button to say abort. And we want the ID for that abort button to be abort. And we want the function that runs when people click this abort button to be the function that we wrote down here, abort, app.abort. Yeah, that's what we called it there. Okay, and now we have to add it back to the document. So, okay, make sure you're updating everything you need to when you're copy pasting abort button. Okay, so now that we have the view for who the user is, let's make the view for who, basically everyone else. Make the purchase button. Honestly, it's pretty repetitive from here on out. You're just sort of creating buttons. So there isn't anything really extremely new here than creating different buttons and basically setting the different functions for when you create the specific buttons. So if you guys will let me sort of skip and not go through this repetitive process, I'm sure it's boring for everybody. So basically, assume that we did everything right. It's all on GitHub. You can pull it, or you can finish it yourself as an exercise. Let's just see the finished product now. That's for basically what we created is the buttons, right? So I'm sorry, I'm not done yet with the front end, but what you created were all the buttons that and all the different select actions that went into our application. So if I go back to my completed directory, and I'll cancel out of the test RPC, and I'll run it up again. Since I stopped the test RPC, I have to make sure that I'm changing and deploying my contracts back onto it. So that's what I'm doing here. And so once you've finished going through all of the creations of buttons and stuff here, I'm going to comment this out because we didn't do this quite yet. So I'm going to run the application.
Oh.
It takes some time for it to, so you gotta wait for it to actually spin up and run. There we go. Okay, so once you finish doing those repetitive button clicking, that